The next game on the list is actually the third entry to one of the longest running fighting game series by a now defunct company, Midway. And that's game number 14, Mortal Kombat 3. A port that had a surprising history between Sony, Midway, and Williams. Published by Sony Computer Entertainment and developed by Midway and Williams. Now, in order to get the full story and its development history, I have to talk about the first two games, because it is the third main entry to the series, and without talking about the previous two titles, you might get confused with the story, and not even mentioning its series where it all started. So with that, I'll make it short as possible. So here we go. For the story of the first game, it takes place in Earthrealm, where a tournament is being held on Shang Tsung's island, where 7 main fighters, Liu Kang, Raiden, Johnny Cage, Kano, Scorpion, Sub-Zero, and Sonya have to fight each other to face against the champion, Goro, and later on beat Shang Tsung, which in the normal ending, Liu Kang defeated him and saved Earthrealm. Then in the second game, it later turned out that Shang was working for Shao Kahn, the supreme ruler of Outworld, and the surrounding kingdoms. Shang told Kahn that if they hold the next Mortal Kombat tournament in Outworld, the Earthrealm warriors must travel away from home to attend. Kahn agreed to his plan, and restores Shang Tsung's youth and martial arts powers. Much like the first, you have to fight each other so they could face Kahn's bodyguard, Kintaro, and then face the mighty Shao Kahn himself. There are a total of 12 fighters, with the returning fighters Liu Kang, Raiden, Johnny Cage, Raiden, Scorpion, Sub-Zero, and the 2 playable fighters that you couldn't play in the original game, Shang Tsung and Reptile, along with some new fighters like Baraka, Jax, Quintana, Kung Lao, and Milena. However, even though Kano and Sonya appeared in the second game, they were not playable since they weren't used that much in the first game. So they appeared as slaves shown in Shao Kahn's arena. Again, much like the first, the normal ending, Liu Kang defeated Shao Kahn and saved Outworld. And now we come to the third game, which in this story, Shao Kahn has risen again after his defeat in the second game. He then revives his former queen Sindel by the Shadow Priests, led by Shang Tsung. With Shang and Sindel helping Kahn, along with his new bodyguard, Motaro, Shao Kahn crosses Earthrealm and Outworld and emerge to be with each other so he could rule both worlds. And also stripping billions of their souls, with only a few that are spread with the help of Raiden, which sadly can't fight with them or even face Kahn, since his protection only extends to the soul, not to the body. So his chosen warriors have to fight the extermination squads and repel Shao Kahn. The main fighters that returned are Liu Kang, Kano, Sonya, Shang Tsung, and Sub-Zero, but with a different look, along with the second game fighters, Jax, Kung Lao, and the now playable fighter, Smoke, although he is a cyborg instead of a ninja. Then we have our new fighters, which are Cyrax, Cabal, Nightwolf, Sector, Sindel, Shiva, and Striker, thus combining with a total of 15 fighters to choose from. You choose a fighter and have to face all the opponents, then defeat Motaro, and finally beat Shao Kahn once again, so both Earthrealm and Outworld would be freed once more. Now, for its development history, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first and second game, and then move straight to the third. So for Mortal Kombat 1, it all started with 2 programmers, Ed Boon and John Tobias, who just got hired by Midway, and asked the new programmers to make an arcade game. Originally, it was going to be a game starring Jean-Claude Van Damme and was going to be sort of a tie-in movie with the 1988 film Bloodsport. but Ed and John wanted to do a ninja fighting game instead of a tie-in movie game. Midway say okay, and the game was in development. Originally, it was only going to be named Combat, but they didn't like the name, so they changed it to Mortal Kombat, but add in a K in Combat. When the first game was released in the arcades in October 8, 1992, it was a smashing hit in the arcades. People could not stop playing it, that it was blood and gore, especially the fatalities. However, there was one group of people that didn't like the game, and that was the parents, saying that it was sick and disgusting of the game. So the congressman from the US decided to create an entertainment software rating board, or ESRB to be short, which debuted in September 16, 1994, making Mortal Kombat 1 the first game to be rated M for mature. After the arcades, it would later be released for home consoles a year later, which the Super NES, Game Gear, Game Boy, and Sega Genesis would all be released in September 13, 1993, aka Mortal Monday. There was also the Master System, MS-DOS, Sega CD, Amiga, and mobile phone, which were released after Mortal Monday. Unfortunately, they removed all the blood and fatalities due to the ESRB rating not existing yet until 1994, except for the Sega Genesis version, which can be accessed by entering a code. Then there was Mortal Kombat 2. According to the project's lead programmer Ed Boon, Mortal Kombat 2 was intended to look different than the original MK and had everything we wanted to put into MK but did not have time for. Despite that, when it was eventually released in the arcades in April 3rd, 1993, it too was a success and even better than the original. Then a year later, it would get home console releases, and like the first, Super NES, Game Gear, and Sega Genesis would be released in September 9th, 1994, aka Mortal Friday. Originally, the Game Boy was supposed to be released alongside with the other consoles in Mortal Friday, but was delayed to October 27th, 1994 due to unknown reasons. Then sooner or later, the Sega 32X, Amiga, Master System, MS-DOS, Sega Saturn, and Sony PlayStation 1. And no, I can't review that one because it was only released in Japan. And unlike the first, which removed all the blood and fatalities, in the sequel, it's all blood and fatalities in all the ports, my man. Naturally, they would go on and do Mortal Kombat 3, which our development history begins. Originally, the game was considered to be made using 3D graphics before reverting to sprite and graphics of the previous games. Its overall style was envisioned differently from the previous Mortal Kombat games. Instead of the heavenly oriental themes of Mortal Kombat and Mortal Kombat 2, the theme of MK3 is more Western inspired. The game's stages are set in modern locations, such as urban highways, churches, and a bridge, modeled after the DuSable Bridge in Chicago, Illinois. 3 of the characters are cyborgs, and traditional character designs, such as Sub-Zeros or Kanos, have been dropped or modified in favor of the modern replacements. This change is also reflected in the soundtrack, in which all Oriental motifs have been dropped in favor of the modern instrumentation. Some of the characters from the previous Mortal Kombat games who returned in Mortal Kombat 3 were portrayed by new actors, since their original portrayers left midway due to royalty disputes over their use of their likeness in console versions. Which makes no sense. Why? I have no answer whatsoever. Maybe they just want to use their likeness for arcades and not on home consoles. But hey, that could be a theory. The cast who did the first 2 Mortal Kombat games, Ho Sung-pak as Liu Kang in the first 2 games, as well as Shang Tsung in the first Mortal Kombat, Philip Ahn as Shang Tsung in Mortal Kombat 2, Elizabeth McKechnie as Sonya Blade, Catalin Zamiar as Katana Milena and Jade, and Daniel Pensina as Johnny Cage and Scorpion / Sub-Zero / Reptile / Smoke and / Noob Saibot were not involved in the production of MK3. Prior to the release of Mortal Kombat 3, Daniel appeared in an advertisement for another fighting game, Bloodstorm, the game I mentioned back in my Street Fighter the Movie review, and said that it was a poor attempt as a Mortal Kombat clone, which resulted in a false rumor that it got him fired by Midway. Thus, Johnny Cage did not appear in the 3rd game, and supposedly killed off by telling that Shao Kahn killed him and stole his soul, according to the fandom. Until he eventually came back in Mortal Kombat Trilogy, but more on that another time. All this led to the use of new actors like Eddie Wong as Liu Kang, Carrie Hoskins as Sonya Blade, John Turk as Shang Tsung and Sub-Zero, and Richard DeVizio as Kano, but also took over the role of Noob Saibot, which is spelled Ed and John's last names backward as a fun fact, as the character was a recolored Kano in this version. Carlos Pensina, who played Raiden in the first 2 games, did not appear in MK3 as a penalty for his involvement in the rival game Tattoo Assassins, which was another poor attempt as a Mortal Kombat clone. But he was still employed by Midway and his character would return in Mortal Kombat Trilogy, although through the use of the recycled sprites from MK2 and new sprites performed by Sal DeVita, and uses a noticeably more muted and less vibrant color palette. Characters were heavily digitalized as opposed to the hybrid digitalized / hand-drawn style of MK2. Many of the game's backgrounds were created using pre-rendered 3D graphics for the first time. The main highlight of the game is the secret codes, which is very usual for arcade games. Most of the codes can unlock new modes, secret characters, and even a difficult version of Galaga. Some can be even seen in magazine promotions, websites, and even the Mortal Kombat movie, which is shown right about here, since that was released the same year as the arcade in August 18, 1995. Even before it was released in the arcades, there was a massive promotional campaign of the upcoming 3rd game. It was so massive that it was even given the world record for the largest promotional campaign for a fighting video game in the 2011 Guinness World Records Gamers Edition. When the 3rd game was released in the arcades in April 15, 1995, it received some very positive reviews, but not as big from the previous 2 games. Why? We'll get to that in a few minutes. Eventually, they would get home consoles released, and like the last 2, were all going to be released in October 13th, 1995, aka Mortal Friday. Again. And another thing, that it was ported to home consoles just 6 months later after it hit arcades, since both MK1 and 2 were home ported about an entire year later. But unfortunately, the planned Mortal Friday was half of a success. Why? Because out of all the home consoles releases, only the Sega Genesis and Super NES was released in that date. As for the Game Boy and Game Gear, the Game Boy had to be delayed to November, and the Game Gear never got an official release in the US. Instead, it was only released in Europe in 1996. As for the other home ports, there were games that were released, like the PC and Master System, but then there were other ports that got cancelled, like the Sega Saturn, Panasonic 3DO, and the Atari Jaguar, that were originally planned to be released in 1996. The reason why, because Sony actually had an exclusive license to the actual identical arcade port of the third game from Williams and Midway, and was released almost a week early before Mortal Friday, since according to a Sega spokesman, Sony paid Midway $12 million for these timed exclusive rights, making this the first 32-bit home port in the Mortal Kombat series. This was a major step for Williams and especially Midway. Why, you may ask? Well, you see, even though they published and developed games, but they only made them in arcades and was only exclusive as an arcade division. Even though we had NBA Jam Tournament Edition for the PlayStation, but was not published or developed by Midway. That one was published by Acclaim and developed by Iguana, but did have the Midway name at the back of the cover. Even the home ports of all the 16-bit Mortal Kombat games were mostly developed by other development companies, most notable Sculpture Software. However, they would later change and have a home console division thanks to its parent company, Williams, who owned both Midway and TradeWest at the time. After several agreements between Sony, Williams, and Midway, they all eventually agreed and the company became both an arcade and home console division at the time. Thus, the PlayStation 1 port marks the first game ever developed for home consoles by Midway themselves, and also Williams too. When the PlayStation version was released in North America in October 7th, 1995, Europe in November 3rd, 1995, and Japan in June 14th, 1996, it was a commercial success and a hit. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it high reviews and marked it as Game of the Month from 1995, even beating out Kilik the DNA Imperative and Total Eclipse Turbo, which both of them are launch titles. Although did criticized on a few changes with the conversion, being that it was like an update to the arcade port, and long loading times of Shang Tsung's morphing into another character due that it was running on a compact disc and have to load all the characters' frame animations. But those were minor differences thanks to the great gameplay. There were 3 things added to the game, but I'll make it short. 1. There's a new finisher move, Animalities, which you can morph into an animal and kill the opponent. 2. You can run by double tapping the arrow buttons either left or right. And 3. It's the first game in the series to feature Choose Your Destiny, either short, medium, or tall. And that's all I gotta say about it. So if that's said, it would be a home run to the critics, but for the fans, well, not so much, because they considered it to be the weakest and blander out of the original arcade trilogy. Why? Well, do you remember a few minutes ago I said it received some positive reviews, but not as big from the previous 2 games? Well, that's exactly what happened. Upon its arcade and console releases, many disliked the inclusion of arguably less appealing new characters, especially Striker, in place of established stalwarts such as Scorpion and Katana. The new combo system was also often criticized, as were to a lesser degree the run mechanics and some finishing moves. According to PC Gamer in 1998, while Mortal Kombat 2 managed to improve upon the fast-paced gore galore formula of the original, the third incarnation didn't fare nearly as well. MK3 suffered from monkey-wrenched gameplay, needlessly stupid finishing moves like Animalities, and unbearably campy character designs. And another thing that most of the stages are bland and generic, like banks, streets, and even a subway, compared to previous 2 titles that had mystic temples, dungeons, and creepy forests. And last but not least, they removed an iconic character. I already mentioned that Johnny Cage and Raiden were not playable in the third game, but for some odd reason, they removed Scorpion in the third game. Why they did this? Well, because Midway wanted to replace ninjas and wanted robots to be the next step in the series. That's why we have Cyrax and Sector, which by the way was named Ketchup and Mustard during development of the game as another fun fact. And also Smoke, which again was originally a ninja in the second game before turning into a cyborg. And as for Sub-Zero, he does appear in the game, but not in his usual ninja outfit. Reasons why is that there is a story of why he's like this. But it will take like forever, so I recommend reading off on the fandom down the link below. So even with Cyrax do have some sort of a similarities to Scorpion's moves, but does not have the same impact like Scorpion. Sure, Liu Kang may be the main protagonist in the MK series, but Scorpion was like the mascot of the franchise, and not having him just doesn't feel like a Mortal Kombat game at all. Instead, feels like a generic fighting game that takes place in a city with somewhat similar to the MK series. But luckily, Midway would upgrade the game and the title would change the title to Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which was released in arcades in November 6, 1995. Fans consider it to be what Mortal Kombat 3 should have been in the first place, which included some of the missing characters, including the iconic Scorpion and also Sub-Zero's original ninja outfit, add a few more stages that sort of resembles from the previous two games, and fixing the balance issues, and would eventually be home ported to the Super NES, Sega Genesis, Sega Saturn, Game Boy Advance, and Nintendo DS, which received positive reviews, except for the GBA, which received negative reviews due to the piss-poor port. A reviewer from online asked John Tobias a question and said the abandonment of icons like Scorpion and Katana ultimately provoked revisions to the MK3 game. What was the impetus for leaving them out, and did you feel that it was the right move to add them back in? Which John replied, actually, leaving them out had nothing to do with provoking UMK3. UMK3 was done to appease arcade operators and make up for the sooner than usual release of MK3's home version by keeping the arcade version fresh. However, this made the original console ports inferior to the Ultimate version, especially the PlayStation version, so making them obsolete. And also that the PlayStation version never got the Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 port, but did eventually got Mortal Kombat Trilogy a year later. But we'll talk about it in the future. For now, let's see if the PS1 port is still worth playing, so with that, let's get on to the review at last. The graphics is okay, even though I still enjoy the aesthetic of the backgrounds and once again, digitalized sprites, but even I could admit that some stages just don't fit, like the streets, a church, which by the way have spikes at the very end, and a subway. But it's just minor nitpicks. The rest do resembles some of the elements of the series, like graveyards, portals, and of course, the pits. And as for the digitalized characters, they're also alright. Really, I have nothing to say but alright. The presentation is good. Now, I already mentioned the animalities, the run button, and choose your destiny, but there is one thing that I haven't talked about, and that is the combo moves, which even shown at the manual, with each different character having their own special moves, except for Smoke since he was a hidden unlockable, but more on that in the gameplay section. And of course, let's not get the stills of the opening, character bios, and the endings that was straight from the arcades. The music is, as you expected, kick-ass, since all of the MK games usually have some great soundtrack. This one is no different. It has great tunes with so much rave, rock, and mystical. Seriously, what more can I say that it's an awesome and, like I said again, kick-ass. And finally, the gameplay. Now, how do I describe it? Well, it's good if you're a professional at fighting games, but for me anyway, it's very hard. I mean, sure, I do suck at most fighting games, but man, it's very tough. Even when I set it up to easy mode, I still get my ass kicked, somewhere between the 3rd or 4th stage. And sadly, I can't beat the game, meaning I can't show you the Motaro fight and the last boss, Shao Kahn. So instead, here are a few clips of someone playing. So even though I suck at it, but that doesn't mean I still enjoyed it. I did like the controls of each character's fight sets, and also the special moves, since that is my basic of just doing the same tactic over and over again. And yes, I'm one of those people who keeps spamming a button at every fighting game, but not always. I also enjoyed the new moves, and also the fatalities and animalities for the most part. And let's not forget about the guy whenever you do a higher punch 2 times in a row. And finally, we have the cheats and hidden codes. Since it was like a tradition of having cryptic secrets from Midway, especially Ed and John, there's your typical cheats like pressing these combinations to access while in the opening demo, and then you press up at the combat and find a cheat of unlocking smoke, one-hit KO, level select, and free play. Which is a good thing, because why the hell was the standard is 5 lives only? Like seriously. And then there is the ultimate combat codes, which can be accessed by entering this code at the copyright screen, and then at the versus screen you can put in the codes. Which once again, I didn't do, so here's another clip of someone putting in the code. This can access a cheat, like here's a few examples, like disabling special moves, fighting in the dark, a fight with Noob Saibot, no power bars, playing through a rough version of Galaga, and etc. There is more codes, but that will take too long. So I'll just leave you with that by checking on the website. Now let's finish this off with the conclusion. This is a good port if you ask me. It's like an almost perfect representation of the arcade version, even though there were some few bumps along the way. But with that, it's still the weakest out of the original trilogy. And the fact that UMK3 was released was even shunned over more. But sadly, so did the series itself at the time, since it was starting to become saturated somewhere in the late 95 and early 96. Not just the games, but movies, TV shows, and a live play. This marks the end of its popularity once the mid-90s came to a close. However, this was not the end of the series, since they continued making MK games either in the main series or a spin-off. Eventually, its popularity did make a comeback during the 2010s with Mortal Kombat 9, but I'm getting ahead of myself. After all, I'm reviewing every PlayStation 1 game from 1995, not reviewing every Mortal Kombat game ever made, so I'll let these guys if you want to learn more about its history. As for me, I'm still going to talk about some of its history that includes the already mentioned MK trilogy in 1996, but also a spin-off in 1997, the 4th main entry in 1998, and another spin-off in 2000. All would be tackled separately in a future history/review. As for the first game for the PS1, it's good, but not spectacular due to Scorpion not being there and broken difficult opponents. But if you simply overlook that, it's still fun and enjoyable, either single or multiplayer, and would recommend if you want to play the original MK3 before the update, both diehards or newbies. So if that's said and done, I give my official rating a 4 out of 6. Next time on the PlayStation years, we go to Namco once again and tackle another game that's based on an arcade port. But however, this game is not that common, even though it was a precursor to a very typical vehicular combat game as we know it today. What is that game? Well, I'll tell you in the next review. Thanks for watching.